In this session, we are going to continue our discussion on Marxist perspective. You will remember that in our last session, I explained to you that the Marxist perspective on state, it has to be examined in two phases. In the last session, we have primarily discussed the first phase in regard to the understanding of the Marxist perspective, which is largely associated with Marx and Engels. This perspective on state, which was originally discussed and articulated by Marx and Engels, this flowed into the discussion of later commentators on Marx and Marxism, and that happened primarily in the 20th century. In 20th century, the Marxist discussion on state or the Marxist understanding of state, it actually reached a very sophisticated level, primarily in the writings of a number of activists, scholars, and theoreticians. We will primarily focus here on four such very important figures. One is V.I. Lenin, the other is Antonio Gramsci, the third is Louis Althusser, and fourth is Nikos Poulantzas. So far as Lenin is concerned, all of you are quite familiar with the name of Lenin, who was the leader of the Russian Revolution of 1917. Now, Lenin's understanding of state, it has to be kept in mind, was primarily a sort of endorsement of the primary view of state, which we have already discussed in our last session. That is, for Lenin, the state, and this is a kind of understanding which Lenin developed in his very famous text, The State and Revolution. In that text, written just a few months before the Russian Revolution, and also in all the writings of Lenin, where we come across his focus on the understanding of state, one thing is quite evident, that is, Lenin primarily believes, Lenin primarily endorses the point that the state is an instrument in the hands of the ruling class, and that this state needs to be destroyed and replaced by a new order which will be controlled by the working class, by the poor, by the propertyless majority. This was Lenin's viewpoint. In other words, what is interesting and what is significant is that in Lenin's writings, we do not come across his endorsement of, or say his discussion of, the secondary view of state. That is, this notion of relative autonomy of state, state as a sort of autonomous structure, the kind of understanding which is associated with the later writings, the historical writings of Marx. We do not come across a reflection of this viewpoint in the writings of Lenin. But there was a major breakthrough in the understanding of the Marxist theory of state in the 20th century when we come across, when we consider, when we take into account the contributions of the writings of a very well-known, in fact, he is known as one of the most important figures of 20th century Marxism. His name was Antonio Gramsci. Antonio Gramsci, who was one of the founding members of the Italian Communist Party and who was arrested by Mussolini, who died in Mussolini's prison, and in his prison life he prepared a huge work that is known as the prison manuscripts. In these writings of Antonio Gramsci, we come across a totally different understanding of the Marxist view of state. It is a totally different understanding in the sense that, number one, Antonio Gramsci's understanding does not go by, or Antonio Gramsci's understanding does not endorse. In fact, it is a major departure from the primary view of state, which we come across in the popular writings of Marx. What Antonio Gramsci endorses is a kind of understanding which is rather close to the secondary view of state which we come across in the later writings of Marx. Now, what is Antonio Gramsci's understanding? What is so novel? What is so peculiar? And what is so innovative about Gramsci's understanding? Gramsci's central concern was this. I have already mentioned that Gramsci was arrested by Mussolini. That is, Gramsci was a person who was writing, who was thinking, who was discussing the Marxist view of state in a fascist state. Fascism was a new experience for the Italian people and also for Antonio Gramsci. Gramsci's central concern, so far as his understanding of the fascist state is to be taken into account, it is this. Number one, why did or how did fascism come to power in Italy? And number two, Gramsci's second concern was that why was it not possible for the ordinary people of Italy, for the Socialist Party of Italy, for the Communist Party of Italy, which had a very powerful working class base, well, why was it not possible for them to resist the coming to power of fascism in Italy? These were the two questions. And in responding to these questions, Gramsci actually developed two very closely interrelated concepts. One concept is called hegemony, the other concept is known as civil society. Gramsci's central understanding is this, that fascism came to power in Italy, and fascism was able to sustain itself in Italy for quite a long time, not simply by using force and violence. That is, if one describes the fascist state simply as a state which rules, which controls the masses by use of force and violence, that would be incorrect. In other words, herein lies the clue to the understanding of Gramsci, that Gramsci does not believe that the state is simply an instrument of force and violence. That is, here we come across the major break of Gramsci with Marx's primary understanding or primary view of state. So, what is Gramsci's explanation? Gramsci's explanation was this, broadly speaking, that the fascist state ruled Italy for quite a long time. In fact, fascism came to power in Italy. Of course, there was exercise of force, there was exercise of violence. Fascism essentially is an ideology of violence. This is all correct. But what is important to note is that fascism could come to power in Italy. Fascism was able to sustain itself in power in Italy by securing the consent of the governed, by securing the consent of the masses. And how did it secure the consent of the masses? Therein comes in the issue of, or the concept of, hegemony. Gramsci says that there are two ways of controlling state power. One is simply by using force and violence. Gramsci calls it domination. The other Gramsci calls hegemony. Hegemony actually means that you secure the consent of the governed by controlling, by manipulating, by influencing the consciousness of the masses. So, if you are able to stay in power by manipulating, by influencing the consciousness of the masses, that is the strategy of hegemony. Gramsci says that one major achievement of fascism was this, one major strategy of fascism was this, that fascism simply did not rule by using force and violence. Fascism was able to secure the consent of the governed. So this is, broadly speaking, what is meant by hegemony. Now, what is meant by civil society? Civil society actually means the network, the complex of institutions associations. Say it may be family, it may be church, it may be school, it may be the different social organizations, it may be universities, it may be colleges, it may be the local clubs. That is, all those organizations, all those associations, all those sites, with the help of which, or by being engaged with which, the people, the individuals, by and large, they develop their cultural, intellectual, social orientation. That is, it is through our association with these institutions like school, college, university, local clubs, associations, etc., etc., that we develop our mental outlook. So this vast network of institutions, that is broadly speaking characterized by Antonio Gramsci as civil society. Now, fascism could come to power, and more importantly, fascism could stay in power for quite a long time in Italy by infiltrating, by controlling, by manipulating, by retaining hold over these institutions and structures of civil society. So, in other words, what Gramsci means, and I think it is now evident, that there is a close connection, close linkage between the notion of hegemony and the notion of civil society. That is, if you have to retain hegemony, then you have to retain your control over civil society. Civil society is the mechanism. Civil society is the tool. Civil society is the kind of bridge by using which you retain your hegemony in society. This is, broadly speaking, the Gramscian understanding. Now, while talking about hegemony and civil society, Gramsci made a very original, I would say highly innovative distinction between two types of state. One kind of state he calls the state which belongs to the model of the East. The other kind of state he calls a state which belongs to the model of the West. By the model of the East, and this is this famous East-West split in Gramsci, that is the kind of hiatus which Gramsci talks about between the East and the West. Well, this is an understanding which Gramsci picks up by referring to two different types of state in European history. The Eastern state Gramsci associated with the pre-revolutionary Russia. The Russian Revolution, according to Gramsci, it was a kind of revolution which struck against the kind of state in Russia, pre-revolutionary Russia, where there was no democracy, where there was no civil society. That is, the pre-revolutionary Russian state, that is the Tsarist state, its strategy of retaining power was the strategy of domination. Since there was no civil society, there was no democracy, it did not care for securing the consent of the governed. It simply ruled from the top. That was the strategy of domination. But in countries of Western Europe, where there had been, for historical, cultural reasons, an advancement of democracy, where there were civil societies. Civil society actually means the private sphere which is not directly controlled by the state. That is the social, cultural institutions in association with which we develop our personality, we develop our identity, we develop our orientation. So this civil society, it has a very powerful presence in the countries of Western Europe. And so, if you have to make a revolution in countries of Western Europe, say in a country like Italy, where you have to actually be engaged with the civil society network, then you have to keep in mind that the states in these societies, whether it is capitalist or whether it is a fascist state, well, in these societies, the states rule not simply by the strategy of domination. It also tries to make use of the strategy of hegemony. And therefore, in these societies, if you have to think in terms of a revolutionary seizure of power, then you have to consider, you have to take into account that how the ruling classes in these societies, by using the strategy of hegemony, they retain their hold on civil society. You have to first conquer the civil society, and then you have to go for the seizure, direct seizure of power. And finally, Gramsci, what he does is this: Gramsci reformulates the Marxist understanding of state. Gramsci's whole understanding is this: Gramsci suggests that the state is nothing but a kind of combination of domination and hegemony. Domination involves the element of force, whereas hegemony involves the element of consent. This is a new kind of formulation, a new kind of understanding which Gramsci introduces in the Marxist discussion of state. Next, we pass on to Louis Althusser, a very famous French philosopher of the 20th century. Althusser's position, or Althusser's understanding of state, again broadly belongs to, or is rather close to, the secondary view of Marx's notion of state. To understand Althusser, we have to focus on two elements in his understanding. First, Althusser argues that, contrary to our traditional Marxist understanding that the base determines the superstructure, that once we understand the economic base of society, you can also derive the character of the state with reference to the socio-economic structure. Well, this rather oversimplistic understanding, oversimplified understanding, is not endorsed by Althusser. Althusser's argument is this, and you can very well guess that this is an understanding which is very close to Marx's secondary view. Althusser argues that there is no such correspondence between the base and the superstructure. Rather, Althusser argues that superstructure retains, or superstructure maintains, a sort of autonomy of its own. Superstructure has a structure, superstructure has an organization, superstructure has constituent elements which are not to be explained, the functioning of which, the nature of which cannot be explained simply with reference to the socio-economic base. So this is the first element of Louis Althusser's understanding of state. That is, state belongs to the superstructure, but superstructure has an autonomy of its own, and the state therefore has a kind of autonomy which is independent, relatively independent of the economic base. Next, the second point of Althusser is much more sophisticated and, one can say, highly original. Althusser argues that there is a very common sense understanding, and this is a somewhat popular understanding, which is associated with Marxism. That is the understanding of revolutionary seizure of power. It is believed generally, that is a standard understanding, that once a revolution takes place, once a revolutionary class, say the working class, now once a revolutionary class seizes state power, then it means control, complete, total, absolute control of political power. That is, once you have captured the state, that means everything now is controlled by you. That is, you have nothing to be afraid of. That is, your final full victory has been scored. And that is the notion that once there is a revolutionary seizure of power, your task of revolution is complete. This is our popular common sense understanding. Althusser, however, here gives us a caution. Althusser argues that the task of revolution is not at all complete with simply revolutionary seizure of state power. Yes, through an act of revolution, it has been possible for a revolutionary class to come to power. But that does not mean the end of the revolutionary process. The revolutionary process remains unfulfilled, incomplete, because the task of revolution is not yet over. Now, why? Althusser argues that here you have to make a distinction between two things. One is state power, the other is state apparatus. Through an act of revolution, you capture state power. But through an act of revolution, you do not necessarily capture state apparatus. State apparatus, it functions, it works somewhat autonomously. Now, what is state apparatus? Louis Althusser argues that the state apparatus, it has two dimensions, or rather it has two constituent elements. One he calls RSA, or repressive state apparatus. The other he calls ISA, that is ideological state apparatus. According to Louis Althusser, it may happen like this, and this is what normally happens, that is, state power is taken over by a revolutionary class. But what remains ignored is this, that the state apparatus continues to be manned by the members of the old or representatives of the old class. For instance, the police, the army, the bureaucracy, the different layers of administration, if they continue to be controlled by the representatives of the old ruling class, now it may so happen that after the revolutionary seizure of power, they change their loyalty. They now openly declare, they openly proclaim that we now stand by the new government. But Althusser says that in terms of class interests, well, they are representatives of the old ruling class. Therefore, with the help of this personnel, with the help of this staff who manned the old apparatus, you cannot continue the agenda of your revolution. This is number one. Therefore, the repressive state apparatus, its personnel, they require change. Second, ideological state apparatus, that is much more complex, that is much more sophisticated, that is much more subtle. That is, yes, the working class has come to power through an act of revolution. That is all right. But according to Althusser, what happens is that the schools, the church, the institutions, the different cultural, social institutions, which continue to retain their cultural hold, cultural influence on us. Well, if they continue to be controlled by old ideas, by old values, by old class, then the agenda of revolution cannot be properly fulfilled. Finally, so far as Poulantzas is concerned, we have in the earlier session discussed the views of Nikos Poulantzas, and where we have seen, I just sum up very briefly Poulantzas' argument. Poulantzas' position is this, that he also, like Althusser, like Gramsci, does not abide by, does not go by the primary view of Marx. He primarily believes in the secondary view of Marx, and he considers the state as a kind of institution, as a kind of structure which has a relative autonomy. By way of conclusion, we can argue that the Marxist understanding of state, it has assumed primarily two directions. One direction is associated with the primary view of state, which was associated originally with Marx and later endorsed by Lenin. Later, the secondary view of Marx, which also was developed by Marx in his lifetime, that was picked up by Antonio Gramsci, Louis Althusser, and Nikos Poulantzas. And in the 20th century Marxism, it is not the primary view, it is the secondary view of the understanding which has gained prominence, which has gained much more popular, and it is with reference to the secondary view of Marxism, or it is the secondary view of Marx, which we have to primarily keep in mind while talking about the Marxist perspective on state. Thank you.